She was cast out under a full moon for a crime she never committed. Her howl was meant to mark her end, but it awakened something ancient instead. The Alpha King was supposed to rule from the throne, not chase fate into the dark. But some bonds don't break when exile begins. They rewrite destiny when the world least expects it. She stood at the center, shoulders squared, chin lifted, trying to make her breathing look steady even as her instincts snarled under her skin. She had earned her place in this pack with seasons of labor and loyalty, with wounds hidden beneath fur and cloth, with decisions made in the dark that kept others alive. Yet the air around her had already changed. Familiar scents turned cautious. Former allies stared through her as if she had become something that did not deserve to be recognized. The accusation had not been spoken with evidence. It had been delivered like a verdict that had waited years for its excuse. The charge was simple enough to repeat and vague enough to poison every mind that heard it. She had violated sacred pack law. She had crossed a line meant to protect them all. The elders framed it as certainty, but the cadence of their authority carried something else beneath it, a tremor of fear. No one said outright what they feared most, because giving it language would make it real. Instead, they dressed the dread in old words, in ritual phrases, in grim nods. They did not need proof when suspicion served their purpose. At the head of the stone ring, the Alpha King remained still, elevated by a shallow rise that made him visible to all. He was the kind of leader the territory had been built to follow, composed, decisive, carved from discipline. Tonight, discipline looked like restraint that cost him something. His gaze tracked the elders as they spoke, then returned to her with a quiet heaviness that suggested he was weighing more than law. He did not interrupt. He did not thunder. He let the ceremony move forward, because tradition had teeth, and the elders knew how to bear them. She had seen councils like this before, though never with her name placed on the altar. The pack's order depended on the illusion that the rules were impartial, that justice was a clean blade. But she could feel the truth in the space between breaths. This was not justice. This was containment. The elders had decided she was too much of something they could not control, and they had waited until the moon gave them an excuse to call the fear sacred. Inside her, something split, not with a dramatic shatter, but with a quiet, unbearable crack. She remembered the cold nights when she had taken the northern watch so others could sleep. She remembered the fevered child she had carried to the healer's den when no one else moved fast enough. She remembered standing between rival patrols and a fragile peace, absorbing blame so the pack could keep calling itself united. All of it rose in her at once, not as pride, but as grief. If loyalty could be erased this easily, then the pack had never loved her. It had only used her. The elders spoke of unity, of safety, of the purity of their laws. The words drifted through the ring, touching shoulders like frost. Around her, packmates shifted their feet, unwilling to meet her eyes for long. Some looked angry. The anger of those relieved the knife had not turned toward them. Others looked ashamed, but shame did not change their silence. It only made their stillness heavier. She searched the Alpha King's face, not for rescue, but for truth. He was listening, but his attention was divided, as though he could hear a second sound beneath the elder's speech. His jaw tightened once, subtle enough that only someone watching him closely would notice. The elders watched him too. They watched for weakness, for hesitation, for any sign he might claim authority over the old rules. They had spent years building their power inside the structure of his crown. Tonight, they expected him to prove that crown belonged to the law they controlled. Her wolf pressed against the edges of her control, a living force inside her ribs. It tasted the fear. It tasted the betrayal. It tasted the unnatural quality of the moonlight and the way the territory seemed to hold its breath. The blood-bright glow made every sense sharper and every heartbeat louder, as if the world itself wanted witnesses. She felt the pack's tension like a rope drawn tight. One sharp pull could snap it. The verdict arrived without ceremony beyond what tradition demanded. Banished, stripped of rank, stripped of protection, forbidden from returning, forbidden from speaking her name in the dens without consequence. The elders did not need to shout. Their certainty was quieter than rage, and that made it more dangerous. They were not punishing her for what she had done. They were expelling her for what they believed she might become. A murmur moved through the circle. It was not sympathy. It was relief mixed with curiosity, the way a crowd reacts when a storm finally breaks. She felt something hot flare behind her eyes and refused to let it spill. If she cried here, it would be claimed as guilt. If she begged, it would be remembered as weakness. They wanted her small. They wanted her silent. Instead, she let her wolf rise. The howl tore out of her as if it had been waiting in her bones, an unfiltered sound that carried heartbreak and defiance in the same fierce breath. It was not a plea. It was a declaration that she still existed, that she would not be folded neatly into their story of wrongdoing and removal. The sound rolled across the stone ring and out into the pines, vibrating through the territory like a struck bell. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Even the elders' expressions faltered, as though the howl had brushed something old and buried inside them. It reached the Alpha King differently. She saw it in the way his eyes sharpened. In the instant his composure shifted from controlled to alert, as if the sound had threaded through him and tugged on a place he did not know could be pulled. Something ancient stirred behind his gaze, not memory exactly, but recognition without explanation. He stood straighter, and the air around him seemed to tighten, responding to a bond neither of them had named. Her exile was enforced without hands laid on her, the pack careful to keep the ritual clean. No physical punishment, no dragged feet, just the cold directive to leave, to walk through the boundary stones that marked the end of their world and the beginning of the forbidden forest. She moved under her own power, because they would not have the satisfaction of seeing her forced. The boundary line waited like a mouth. Beyond it, the trees grew denser, older, their branches interlacing like ribs. The forest had a reputation built from whispered warnings, strange paths, vanishing tracks, the sense that the wilderness watched back. It was the place the pack used as a threat for children and as a graveyard for problems adults did not want to solve. The moonlight did not soften there. It only made the darkness look deeper. She stepped over the threshold, and the temperature seemed to change immediately, as though the territory itself had rejected her. Behind her, the stone ring remained bright and orderly, filled with faces that told themselves they had done the necessary thing. Ahead, the forest swallowed sound and offered no comfort. Her heartbeat steadied into a hard rhythm. She would survive, even if survival meant becoming someone the pack could no longer recognize. She did not look back, but she felt it, the shift in presence, the pull of attention following her like an invisible thread. In the distance, within the safety of his crown and the scrutiny of the elders, the Alpha King remained motionless for a long moment. Then, without announcing it, without asking permission from law or council, he turned away from the ring. His steps were quiet, but his decision was not. He moved toward the boundary stones as if compelled by the echo of her howl, crossing the line his predecessors had never crossed for anyone. The territory behind him held its breath as he entered the dark. The moment the Alpha King crossed the boundary stones, the world shifted in a way no law had prepared him for. The fortress behind him, with its high walls and familiar order, fell silent in his senses, as if it had already begun to recede into something less real. Ahead, the forbidden forest breathed differently. The air was heavier, layered with old scents and unfamiliar currents that did not yield easily to rank or command. This land did not respond to authority. It responded to truth, and he could feel it measuring him with quiet attention. He followed the echo of her howl not as a sound but as a pull, something that threaded through his chest and tightened whenever he strayed too far from its path. Logic told him to turn back. Every rule he had sworn to uphold warned him that this was a mistake that would fracture the pack's faith in him. The elders would not forgive this breach, and the territory would remember it long after excuses turned to ash. Yet instinct spoke louder, older than the laws carved into stone. It told him that if he did not follow her now, something essential would be lost forever. As he moved deeper into the forest, his thoughts turned inward despite his efforts to remain focused. He had ruled by balance for years, weighing mercy against strength, tradition against change. This decision shattered that balance. He was no longer choosing between right and wrong as the pack defined it. He was choosing between obedience and something unnamed that had existed long before tonight, long before he wore the crown. The bond he refused to acknowledge pressed harder with every step, not demanding, but reminding him that denial did not erase truth. The forest seemed to sense his unrest. Branches shifted subtly, leaves whispering against one another though no wind moved through them. The ground softened beneath his boots, not treacherous, but testing. It was as if the land itself recognized that something had been broken and was deciding whether to allow the fracture to heal or widen. He felt watched, not by predators, but by memory, by a presence that knew the history of wolves long before packs divided themselves with borders and laws. Far ahead, unseen but deeply felt, she moved through the darkness alone. The heroine's strength had carried her farther than she expected, but exile took its toll quickly when stripped of familiar paths and protection. The forest did not attack her, yet it did not shelter her either. Roots caught at her steps, and low branches brushed against her shoulders as though marking her passage. At some point she realized she was bleeding, not from a single wound but from the accumulation of small injuries earned through stubborn forward motion. The pain was sharp enough to demand attention, yet it also grounded her, reminding her that she was still alive, still moving, still choosing. She had always drawn power from the pack, from shared rhythms and layered howls that reinforced belonging. Alone, that familiar well was gone. In its absence, something else stirred, tentative at first, then steadily more insistent. It was not the borrowed strength of hierarchy or role. It was her own, raw and unfiltered, rising in response to necessity. She discovered she could quiet her fear without another presence anchoring her. She could read the forest's moods by listening instead of asserting. Each realization unsettled her as much as it steadied her, because it suggested she had been more contained and protected all along. The moonlight fractured through the canopy, painting her path in broken silver. She paused near a narrow stream, lowering herself carefully to drink. The water was cold enough to numb her lips, but it cleared the haze in her thoughts. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine turning back, not to beg, but to confront. The image dissolved quickly. The pack she had known no longer existed for her, and whatever awaited her now required forward motion, not nostalgia. Behind her, the Alpha King felt the distance between them contract and expand unpredictably, like a living thing. At times the pull sharpened, nearly dragging him forward with urgency. At others, it dulled, as though the forest deliberately bent her trail away from him. Frustration crept in, edged with fear he refused to name. He had faced challenges to his rule, negotiations with rival packs, and the slow erosion of old alliances, but none of that unsettled him like this invisible chase. This was not a pursuit of an enemy or a rescue sanctioned by law. This was a crossing of fate's thin ice. He sensed the land reacting more strongly the farther he went. Certain paths opened while others closed without warning. Scents overlapped and blurred, making tracking difficult even for his trained senses. It was not sabotage. It felt more like a test, as though the forest required intention rather than skill. When he let go of rigid purpose and trusted the pull instead, the path clarified, subtle signs aligning just enough to guide him forward. Unaware of how close he truly was, the heroine pressed on, exhaustion creeping into her limbs. Her unfamiliar strength held, but it demanded adaptation. She could not move as she once had, relying on pack-formed instincts. She had to slow, to choose her footing, to listen when the forest whispered warnings through the snap of a twig or the sudden silence of night creatures. The realization that she was learning, even now, sparked a quiet defiance. Exile had not ended her. It was reshaping her. Their paths curved toward one another near a stand of ancient trees, trunks twisted together as if grown in deliberate union. For a moment, their breaths shared the same air without their knowledge. The Alpha King paused, a sharp awareness tightening his spine, certain she was close enough to touch. At the same instant, she felt an inexplicable pressure in her chest, a sense of being seen that made her turn instinctively away. Fate, deliberate and unkind, slid them past each other without allowing reunion. The near miss left him unsettled, the pull surging with renewed urgency. He quickened his pace, no longer concerned with stealth, driven by the growing certainty that something was wrong. The forest sounds shifted again, not in welcome or challenge, but in warning. The night seemed to fold in on itself ahead, shadows thickening where moonlight should have reached. She felt it too, though she could not name it. The unfamiliar strength within her flared, alerting her to a presence that did not belong to the forest's usual rhythm. It was not pursuit in the way the pack understood it, but attention focused too sharply, like a gaze that lingered too long. Her instincts urged caution, urged silence, urged movement all at once. She adjusted her path, heart beating faster, every sense straining. Behind her, the Alpha King slowed, dread coiling tight and cold. The pull had changed. It was no longer just calling him forward. It was warning him that time was thinning, and that whatever waited in the dark was drawing closer to her with patient intent. He moved again, faster now, the forest bending just enough to let him pass, while unseen eyes followed her steps from the shadows she had not yet noticed. The forest grew stranger the deeper she went, not in the obvious ways the pack's warnings described, but in subtler distortions that made her question her own senses. The air became almost metallic, like a storm waiting to break, and the moonlight that filtered through the canopy took on a pale, diluted quality. Her steps slowed as the ground changed beneath her feet from soft loam to something harder, older, as if she had wandered onto a forgotten road that no longer belonged to the living world. Trees thinned in irregular patches, opening into clearings that felt too deliberate to be natural, as though the wilderness had been arranged by an ancient hand. When she first saw the stones, she thought exhaustion was shaping illusions. Dark pillars rose from the earth at crooked angles, their surfaces worn smooth by time but carved with faint markings that caught the light when she shifted her head. The ruins were not the broken remnants of a single structure. They were a ring, a circle of standing stones half swallowed by moss and roots, each one positioned with quiet precision. The place smelled different too, stripped of ordinary forest scents. It carried the dry, cold scent of history. She should have turned away. Every instinct told her that this was the sort of place packs avoided for good reason. But something else tugged at her, the same inexplicable pull that had haunted her since the moment of exile. It was not comfort, it was recognition, a feeling so intimate it made her chest tighten. Her wolf, usually restless inside her, fell unnervingly silent, as if it sensed an authority here that did not need to assert itself. She stepped into the ring. The moment her boot crossed the boundary formed by the stones, the world sharpened. Sounds muted, then returned layered and distant, like echoes arriving late. The moon above seemed to brighten, not in the sky, but in the air around her, as if its light had been waiting for her to enter this exact place. Heat surged through her veins with a suddenness that made her sway. For an instant she thought she might faint, but the sensation did not fade. It deepened, spreading through her body like a waking current. Her breath caught as images flashed behind her eyes, too vivid to be imagination. She saw a woman standing where she stood, hair whipping in a wind that did not exist now, hands raised toward the sky as the same moon burned bright above. She saw wolves kneeling, not in submission, but in grief, their howls braided together in a chorus that sounded like mourning and warning at once. The vision shifted and she saw a man crowned in shadow, his face blurred yet unmistakably alpha, his posture rigid with pride and fear. A chain of symbols flickered between them, binding him across time like an unseen tether. The heroine's knees nearly buckled. She caught herself against one of the stones, palm pressing to the carved markings. The moment she touched it, the carvings warmed beneath her hand, responding as if they had been asleep and her skin was the key that unlocked them. A low vibration hummed through the pillar and into her bones. She felt it not as sound, but as language without words, a meaning carried through blood. More visions came, sharper now, no longer random flashes but a sequence unfolding with cruel clarity. She saw a bargain made long ago, not between lovers, but between lineages. Two bloodlines had been intertwined to seal a threat away, to trap something dangerous beneath ritual and promise. One line belonged to a wolf-born woman who carried wild magic in her veins. The other belonged to an Alpha King's house, rulers who swore to contain that power, to guard it, to ensure it never rose unchecked. The pact had not been gentle. It had been survival disguised as honor. Then she saw the betrayal that followed. Not a single dramatic act, but slow erosion, rulers who feared the power they guarded, elders who wanted control without consequence, laws rewritten in careful language to make the curse feel like discipline instead of imprisonment. The sacred rules were not only rules. They were locks, tightened generation after generation, until the original reason was buried beneath ritual. She jerked her hand away, heart hammering. The knowledge was too much, arriving all at once. Yet it explained the fear in the elder's eyes, the eagerness to remove her under the full moon, the way the pack had accepted the accusation without proof. They had not exiled her because she broke the law. They had exiled her because her existence threatened the system built to contain her bloodline. Even if they did not consciously understand it, their instincts had guided them to the old design: isolate her, push her into the wilderness, let the ancient mechanisms awaken. Her banishment had not been punishment. It had been a trigger. Far behind her, the Alpha King felt the pull snap into something sharper, like a rope pulled taut without warning. He stopped mid-step, breath frosting the air, as a wave of unease rolled through him. For a heartbeat he could not tell if the sensation belonged to him or to the bond that refused to be named. Then the forest around him reacted, birds erupted from branches in frantic bursts, and the hush that followed carried a weight that pressed down on his shoulders. Something had begun, and it was moving faster than he could catch up. He turned back toward the territory, not retreating, but calculating. The Elders' Council chamber held records most were never permitted to see. He had avoided them for years, believing that the past was best left undisturbed. Tonight, that belief felt like blindness. If she was out there facing something unknown, and if his instincts were screaming that it involved him, then the truth could not remain locked away. He moved with the quiet decisiveness of a ruler who knew exactly what he was risking. Returning to the fortress without explanation would invite suspicion, but he no longer cared about suspicion. He cared about certainty. Inside the stronghold, he bypassed the main hall and went to the oldest wing, where stone corridors narrowed and torches burned lower, as if even fire hesitated to live there. The records chamber was sealed with symbols of authority and tradition. He broke the seal with his own signet, feeling the weight of that choice settle into his bones. Dust rose as he pulled open a heavy ledger bound in dark leather. The pages smelled of age and secrecy. He did not read as a curious leader. He read as a man hunted by a truth he could no longer outrun. The words were written in formal script, but the meaning beneath them was brutal. A curse had been bound to his lineage, tethered to a woman's bloodline, and the bond between them was not a romantic myth. It was a mechanism, a key, a fuse. The full moon was not just a night of ceremony. It was a signal. Exile beyond the boundary stones was not just removal. It was activation. His throat tightened as he turned another page and found the line that made his blood run cold. Once awakened, the curse could not be put back to sleep by law or command. It would either be completed, or it would break free in ways that would reshape the territory forever. Back in the ruins, the heroine felt the forest changing around her as if it had heard the same truth and was responding. The air warmed, then cooled, cycling in unnatural waves. The trees at the edge of the clearing leaned inward slightly, their branches angling as though drawn toward the stone ring. The carvings on the pillars glowed faintly now, lines of light threading through cracks and moss, turning the ruin into a quiet, pulsing circle. She backed away, but the pull held her in place. The power inside her, once silent, surged again, no longer tentative. It rose like a tide, filling her chest, her throat, her hands. She could feel it searching for form, for release, for completion. Fear tightened her ribs, but beneath that fear was something else, the realization that she had never been ordinary, and that the pack's rejection had not erased her purpose. It had simply shoved her toward it. In the distance, the Alpha King slammed the ledger shut, breath harsh, eyes dark with understanding. Their bond was not a mistake. It was ancestry reaching forward through time, dragging them toward a reckoning neither of them had chosen. He left the records chamber with urgency, the fortress suddenly too small, too fragile, as if walls could not protect anyone from what was already waking. In the ruins circle, the heroine's pulse synced with the glowing runes. The light brightened, the air thickened, and the forest's silence became absolute, as if the world had paused to watch. Somewhere deep within her blood, something ancient opened its eyes. The light in the ruin did not fade when she stumbled backward. It followed her like a living thing, clinging to the edges of her vision and pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The carved stones no longer looked like weathered monuments, they looked awake, their markings brightening into lines that seemed to rearrange themselves when she tried to focus. The forest around the clearing held an unnerving stillness, as though every creature had retreated to let something older take the stage. In that silence, her own breath sounded too loud, too human, as if the power gathering in her had begun to reject the fragile body that carried it. She tried to steady herself by naming what she knew. She was a wolf of Grapevine. She had been a guardian, a hunter, a loyal packmate. She had been banished. Those facts should have anchored her, but they slid away like leaves on water. The truth pressing up through her blood made those identities feel like roles she had been assigned rather than the full shape of her existence. She could feel it now, the way the pack's laws had wrapped her like bindings, the way obedience had dulled instincts that were never meant to be quiet. The power swelled again, rising with a pressure that made her ribs ache. She staggered to the edge of the ring, expecting relief once she stepped out. Instead, the boundary followed. The sensation did not belong to the stones anymore. It belonged to her. The ruin had not given her something foreign. It had awakened what had been buried so deep she had mistaken the silence for normalcy. Her wolf stirred for the first time since she entered the ring, but it did not feel separate from her now. It felt braided into her veins, as if she had always been two forces contained in one body and only now understood how tightly she had been folded. The first howl rose in her throat before she made the decision to release it. It pushed up like a reflex, like breath after drowning. When it broke free, the sound was not simply loud. It was vast. It carried across the trees with a resonance that made the air tremble, threading itself into the land as if the territory itself had nerves and her voice had touched them. The howl was not a cry of pain or grief. It was a command without intention, an order spoken in a language older than pack law. The forest answered in ways she did not expect. Far beyond the clearing, distant howls echoed back, not from her own pack, but from places long considered silent. The responses were faint at first, like voices waking after centuries of sleep, then stronger, layered with confusion and recognition. She could feel them through the ground more than through her ears. Something was stirring beyond the borders. In hollows and ravines the pack maps marked as empty. Dormant packs, forgotten bloodlines, lone wolves that had hidden for generations, all hearing a call that did not belong to any reigning alpha. The realization hit her with a chill that cut through the heat in her veins. She was not simply making noise. She was moving the world. Her second howl came sharper, edged with panic as she tried to test the boundary of what was happening. Again the land answered. The trees at the edge of the clearing rustled without wind, their branches angling toward her as if listening. The moonlight brightened, spilling into places the canopy should have blocked. She felt a line extend outward from her chest, invisible but undeniable, connecting her to the territory in a way she had never known was possible. It felt like standing at the center of a web made of instinct and memory, each thread taut with potential. She tried to stop it. She tried to swallow the power back down, to return to the simpler reality where her survival depended on her own strength alone. But the power did not retreat. It surged in response to resistance, as if it had been starving and now refused to be denied. Her hands trembled. Her senses sharpened until the forest became unbearable in detail, the damp decay of moss, the sharp resin of pine, the distant water running over stone. The world felt too close, too loud, too alive. Then she felt him. At first it was only a shift in the air, a familiar presence pushing against the edge of the clearing. Her wolf recognized him before her mind did, and the power inside her flared, reacting like a spark meeting dry tinder. She turned, breath-catching, and saw the Alpha King emerge from between the trees. He stopped at the boundary of the ruin's influence, as if he could sense that stepping closer might trigger something he could not control. Moonlight cut across his face, revealing exhaustion etched into his features and a tension in his posture that did not belong to the composed ruler the pack knew. His eyes locked on her, and for a moment he looked like a man seeing a legend come alive in the worst possible way. All flickered there, quickly chased by fear he tried to hide. He did not speak her name. He did not issue a command. He simply stared, as though he was memorizing the shape of what she had become, trying to reconcile it with the woman he had watched stand in the stone circle hours earlier. His presence brought a rush of emotion she had been holding back since the moment of exile. Betrayal tightened her throat. Relief stabbed through her chest so sharply it felt like pain. Anger followed, hot and immediate, because he had been there. He had let it happen. Even if he had followed her afterward, the memory of his silence in the council ring remained like a bruise. He took one slow step forward, careful, as if approaching something sacred and dangerous. The forest reacted, the glowing lines on the stones pulsing brighter. He froze. The instinctive authority that shaped every room he entered did not work here. The land did not bow to his crown. It leaned toward her. The Alpha King's jaw tightened, and something shifted in his expression, regret breaking through the disciplined mask. He looked like he wanted to explain, to justify, to tell her that tradition had cornered him, that the Elder's eyes had been blades. But the way he held himself suggested he knew explanations would not undo what had been done. His voice, when it finally came, sounded lower than usual, restrained not by command but by caution. He spoke as if choosing each word carefully, aware that the wrong tone might ignite whatever was rising inside her. She did not answer with words. She could not trust her voice to carry anything but raw emotion. Instead, she let silence stretch between them, letting him feel the weight of what his absence had cost. Her power throbbed under her skin, restless, as if it recognized him as part of its design and resented him for it. The bond between them pressed into the space, undeniable now, not romantic softness but an ancient tether that made her want to step toward him and step away at the same time. He tried again, shifting his stance in a way that would have been familiar in the pack ring, an alpha preparing to lead. The motion looked wrong here. The ruin's light flickered, and the forest seemed to lean away from him, refusing the claim. He noticed, and the realization landed heavily. His authority meant nothing against what she was becoming. His crown could not command the land if the land had chosen her voice as its signal. She watched him absorb that truth, and something inside her steadied. For the first time since exile, she did not feel small in his presence. She felt vast, frighteningly so, and that frightened her more than it empowered her. If she returned with him, would the pack try to bind her again? Would the elders sharpen new laws to cage what they could not understand? Would she be forced back into obedience, taught to fear herself the way they feared her? The Alpha King held out his hand, not as a demand but as an offering. His eyes did not leave hers. The gesture carried everything he could not say: apology, responsibility, a plea for trust. The bond tugged at her, painful in its insistence, and for a heartbeat she almost moved. Then she remembered the stone ring, the verdict spoken without proof, the way the pack had looked away while her world collapsed. She took a step backward instead, toward the glowing stones and the wild power humming in the air. The Alpha King's hand remained outstretched, but his expression tightened with the understanding that he could not force this. He could only follow. Her voice finally came, quiet but steady, carrying a firmness that did not belong to fear. She would not go back. Not yet. Not until she knew whether returning meant surrendering herself again. The forest pulsed in answer, and the ruins' light brightened around her as if sealing her choice. The pack did not sleep after the exile. The fortress stayed awake in fragments, whispers in corridors, tense glances across doorways, patrols doubled under the excuse of caution. By dawn, the elders had turned fear into strategy. They spoke of protection, of preventing a disaster, of ensuring the Banished did not return carrying whatever darkness the forbidden forest was rumored to breed. Their language was careful, polished for public consumption, but the intent beneath it was blunt. They wanted control back, and the easiest way to reclaim it was to erase the problem before it could grow. A hunting party was assembled with speed that felt rehearsed. The chosen wolves were not the gentlest or the wisest, they were the most obedient, the most eager to prove loyalty to the old order. They were given a simple mission with a noble mask: locate her, assess the threat, escort her father if necessary. No one used the word eliminate, yet it hovered in the spaces between instructions. The hunters accepted the framing because it allowed them to avoid confronting what they truly felt. They were not protecting the pack from her actions. They were protecting the pack from the shame of what they had done. The Alpha King watched them prepare from the edge of the courtyard, his face unreadable, his hands still. The elders stood near him, pretending they were merely advising, but their eyes were sharp with expectation. They believed he would approve the hunt, because a ruler who hesitated was a ruler who could be replaced. He could feel their calculation, the way they tracked his breathing and posture as if searching for cracks in his authority. They had always feared what lived beyond their reach. Tonight, that fear wore her name. He did not stop the hunters with a command in the open. Instead, he let them leave under the guise of sanctioned duty, then followed alone with the quiet inevitability of a storm. His choice was not impulsive now. It was deliberate, rooted in the truth he had uncovered in forbidden records and the certainty that the elders' protection would ignite the very curse they claimed to fear. If the hunters pushed her, if they cornered her, the power waking in her blood would answer. The pack would call it proof of guilt, and the elders would use it as justification to tighten the grip. The cycle would complete itself unless someone broke it. The forest received the hunters with cold indifference. The disciplined formation loosened as soon as they passed the boundary stones, because wilderness did not respect rank. They moved carefully, speaking in low tones that tried to sound confident. Yet even they could feel it, the subtle change in the air, the way scents layered strangely, the faint pulse of something unseen that made their wolves restless. They told themselves it was superstition. Deep down, they knew it was not. Far ahead, near the ring of ancient stones, the heroine stood with the Alpha King close enough now to be unmistakably present but not close enough to claim her space. She had not returned to the pack, she had not fled deeper either. She remained near the ruins because the place felt like both a warning and a shelter, as if it had awakened with her and now refused to let her drift back into ignorance. The power in her had steadied into a constant hum, no longer surging wildly, but alive in every breath. It made her feel larger than her own skin, connected to the land in a way she could not explain without sounding like myth. When the hunters drew near, she sensed them before she saw them. Their fear carried through the trees like a bitter scent. Their intent was disguised, but their nerves betrayed them. She did not need to hear their footsteps. The territory itself seemed to shift its attention in the direction, alerting her the way a body alerts a wound when something sharp approaches. The Alpha King heard him too. He stepped forward into the open line between the stone ring and the tree line, making himself visible before the hunters could surprise her. The moment they saw him, they faltered, confusion rippling through their formation. They had expected distance from their ruler, not his presence in the forbidden forest. Their leader, a broad-shouldered wolf who had always been quick to obey elders, forced himself to speak with respect. He described the mission as protection. He called it necessary. He did not mention fear, but it pulsed beneath every word. The Alpha King's response was calm, and that calm was more unsettling than anger. He asked them who authorized the hunt. They hesitated, then named the elders with the careful phrasing of wolves who believed they were saying the right thing. The Alpha King's gaze narrowed slightly, not at them, but at what they represented. He could feel the old system tightening around itself, using these loyal hunters as tools. He did not blame them for being used. He blamed the hands that guided them. He raised his voice just enough for it to carry through the trees, a sound that held authority and challenge in equal measure. He declared that the hunt ended here. The leader bristled, torn between obedience to the Alpha and obedience to the elders who controlled his future inside the pack. The tension sharpened into a quiet standoff, thick with the kind of conflict that did not need claws to be dangerous. A wrong word could splinter loyalty. A wrong step could become legend. The Alpha King did not reach for threats. Instead, he invoked something older than the elders' influence, older than the rewritten laws. He spoke the name of an ancient mercy rite, a ritual reserved for moments when the pack faced a choice that could redefine it. Few alphas used it because it bound them publicly to compassion that could be interpreted as weakness. He used it anyway, because the alternative was to let fear write their future. The hunters stared as if he had spoken a forbidden language. The mercy rite demanded that all aggression stop until the accused was seen clearly, until judgment was made with truth instead of rumor. It demanded that the Alpha place himself between the pack and the condemned, accepting responsibility for whatever outcome followed. In invoking it, he announced to the forest, to the territory, and to anyone who would later hear the story that he rejected the Elder's path. Behind him, the heroine listened in silence, her emotions tightening into a knot that was hard to name. Part of her wanted to turn away and let the pack face the consequences of their own fear. Part of her wanted to end the threat permanently, not through physical destruction, but through a decisive release of power that would make them unable to approach her again. She could feel how easily she might do it now, how the land would answer her howl with overwhelming force. The realization frightened her because it came with temptation, and temptation was a kind of test. The hunters shifted, uneasy, sensing that the balance of power had changed. They could feel it too, the way the air leaned toward her even though she had not moved. Their wolves whined under their skin, recognizing something they could not rank or challenge. Fear sharpened their discipline into rigidity. They wanted instruction. They wanted permission to stop being brave. The Alpha King turned his head slightly, enough to glance back at her without breaking the line he held. His eyes did not plead. They acknowledged her choice as hers alone. That was the difference now. He was not commanding her. He was giving her space to decide what she would be in the story that followed. She stepped forward, just one pace, and the glowing carvings on the stones pulsed faintly as if responding to her movement. The hunters stiffened. She could have spoken a threat. She could have demanded apology. She did neither. Instead, she let her presence settle into the clearing like a weight that forced honesty. In that moment, she understood that mercy was not softness. Mercy was control. It was the refusal to let those who feared her define her power as only destruction. She met the hunters' eyes one by one, making them feel seen in their fear and their shame. Then she chose restraint, allowing the land's attention to ease rather than tighten. The shift was immediate. The air lightened slightly, as if the forest exhaled. The decision cost her more than she expected. The power inside her resisted being held back, surging against her will like a tide pressing at a dam. She felt her knees weaken, her breath catch. The mercy she offered the pack demanded she contain what was waking in her, and containment drained her. She steadied herself with sheer stubbornness, refusing to show how the effort shook her body from the inside. The Alpha King sensed the change and the strain. He did not move to catch her, because even that gesture might be interpreted as ownership. He held the line, voice firm, ordering the hunters to return and report that the mercy rite had been invoked. The hunters hesitated, still caught between powers, then finally backed away, retreating with the stiff relief of wolves spared from making an irreversible mistake. As their footsteps faded, the heroine's breath came shallow. She turned slightly, as if the world had tilted. The forest remained quiet, but the quiet felt charged, as though something had been postponed rather than prevented. The Alpha King watched her, jaw tight, realizing that her mercy had changed the equation the elders relied on. It proved she was not the monster they wanted her to be, and it proved he was willing to defy them publicly. Back at the fortress, the elders would interpret this as betrayal. They would not see mercy as strength. They would see it as the alpha slipping from the grasp, and they would move quickly to tighten their hold while they still could. In the clearing, the heroine steadied herself again, eyes dark with exhaustion and resolve, while the Alpha King stood between her and the pack sphere, knowing the true fight was now turning inward, toward the council that had engineered her exile. The hunters returned to the fortress with faces drawn tight by what they could not fully explain. They delivered their report in careful phrases, repeating the Alpha King's invocation of the mercy rite as if the words themselves might bite. The elders listened without interrupting, their expressions controlled, but their scent betrayed them. Anger, sharp and sour, spread through the council chamber like smoke. They did not rage openly. They did not need to. Their power lived in restraint, in the ability to make threats feel like procedure. By nightfall, the pack's unity began to split along lines that had always existed but had never been forced into the light. Some wolves whispered that the Alpha King had dishonored tradition, that he had placed a banished wolf above the safety of his own people. Others whispered that the elders were the ones dishonoring the pack, twisting law into a weapon because fear made them desperate. Conversations stopped abruptly when certain figures entered a room. Patrol assignments became political statements. Even the way wolves chose where to stand during meals began to look like allegiance. The Alpha King moved through the fortress with steady purpose, but he could feel the ground shifting under his rule. His authority had never been absolute, not truly. It had always been negotiated through customs the elders controlled. Now those customs were being used against him. They called private meetings without him. They sent messengers to influential families. They framed his actions as recklessness, and they did it with a calm that made their intent unmistakable. They were preparing the pack to accept the idea that the crown could be removed for the pack's good. He could have responded with forceful decrees, but that would have played into their narrative. Instead, he did something more dangerous. He chose to leave the fortress again, slipping away before dawn with only his instincts and his certainty. If the elders wanted to paint him as unstable, he would not give them a spectacle. He would give them outcomes. He had made one choice already by invoking mercy. Now he needed to make another by ensuring she survived what that mercy had awakened. In the forest, the heroine's exhaustion had not disappeared. Containing her power after sparing the hunters left her feeling hollowed out, as if she had poured something vital into the air and the air had refused to return it. Yet the weakness did not feel like defeat. It felt like consequence, and consequence was something she could respect. She had been treated like a threat because the pack feared what she might become. If she became exactly what they feared, she would be proving them right. That refusal steadied her more than any promise could. The Alpha King found her near the ruins again, not because he tracked her footprints, but because the bond between them behaved like a compass he could no longer deny. She was sitting with her back against one of the stones, eyes half-lidded, the moonlight making her look carved from shadow and silver. When she noticed him, she did not rise. She did not offer hostility either. She simply watched him with the quiet assessment of someone deciding whether his presence healed or harmed. He sat a careful distance away, close enough to be real but far enough to respect the invisible boundary she had drawn around herself. The forest felt different when they shared it. The air carried a subtle charge, like a storm line hovering overhead, waiting for a reason to break. Neither of them spoke of love. Neither of them named the bond. Yet everything in their silence confessed what words avoided. He stayed because leaving felt impossible. She allowed him to stay because, despite everything, his presence made the world feel less sharp. Their connection deepened without tenderness that could be easily dismissed. It was built through choices, the way he positioned himself between her and threat, the way she did not unleash her power against those who would have erased her, the way both of them remained in the uncomfortable space where trust had to be rebuilt from ash. He watched her hands when they trembled slightly from strain, and he did not treat her as fragile. She watched his face when he thought of the pack, and she saw the burden he carried without complaint. The intimacy lived in observation, in quiet accountability, in the knowledge that neither could pretend this was a coincidence anymore. That night, the visions returned. The heroine's sleep was shallow, and when the forest quieted fully, the ruined stones began to hum again, low and insistent. She drifted into a trance-like state she did not choose, her consciousness sliding into images that felt like memory even though they were not hers. She saw a hall filled with wolves kneeling, not in loyalty but in fear. She saw an alpha and a wolf-born woman standing together at the center, their joined presence causing the old hierarchies to buckle. Elders shouted soundlessly, their mouths moving in outrage as their authority crumbled into dust. The pack structure collapsed not through war, but through truth, because the bond at the center made the old lies impossible to sustain. Then the vision sharpened, and she saw what came after: a reshaped territory, borders altered, alliances broken and rebuilt. Some wolves thrived in the new order. Others resisted, unable to live without the certainty of rigid law. The message was not comfort. It was warning. If she and the Alpha King stood together openly, the pack as it existed would not survive unchanged. The union would become a blade that cut the old system apart. When she woke, her breath came fast, and the Alpha King was watching her with a tension that suggested he had sensed the shift even without sharing the vision. She did not tell him everything. She did not need to. He read enough in her eyes to understand that fate had shown her a future heavy with consequences. He confessed his own discovery in a way that sounded less like confession and more like surrender to reality. The elders were moving against him. They were building the case to remove his crown, and they would use her existence as their sharpest weapon. If he brought her back, they would call it proof of recklessness. If he refused to bring her back, they would call it weakness. The trap was complete, designed to leave him with no choice that did not benefit them. The heroine listened, and something inside her hardened. She had never wanted to be the reason a leader fell. She had never wanted her survival to cost others their stability. The pack had already shown it could turn fear into cruelty. If she stayed near him, the elders would not stop. They would escalate until the territory burned with paranoia. She could feel how close that escalation was, how quickly whispers could become orders. At the edge of the forest, signs of that escalation were already forming. Scouts returned to the fortress with reports of unfamiliar scents near the borders, of wolves moving in coordinated patterns beyond the outer ridge. Rival packs had always watched Grapevine for weakness, waiting for the moment the territory's leadership fractured. Instability was an invitation, and her exile had cracked the door open. The Alpha King heard those reports too, carried by messengers who still trusted him. He understood what the enemy packs would do. They would not charge openly. They would test, probe, steal resources, turn smaller patrols against each other with planted rumors. They would use the elders' fear and the pack's confusion as leverage. A territory divided was a territory that could be dismantled piece by piece. The heroine looked at him in the moonlight and felt the ache of an impossible choice. If she left forever, the elders would lose their sharpest excuse. The Alpha King might stabilize the pack long enough to repel outside threats. If she stayed, she might become the center of a transformation that the old system could not survive. Part of her wanted that transformation. Part of her feared what it would cost him. She rose slowly, the movement deliberate, as if she needed her body to understand what her heart already knew. She stepped away from the stone ring, then stopped, turning back toward him one last time. The Alpha King stood as well, his posture tense with the knowledge of what she was considering. He did not order her to stay. He did not beg her to go. His restraint was its own kind of devotion, and it made her throat tighten with emotion she refused to let spill. Before she could decide, a new sound cut through the night, distant, layered, unmistakably coordinated. It was not the howl of a lone wolf. It was a signal exchanged between multiple voices, disciplined and deliberate. The forest seemed to recoil, and the air carried an unfamiliar scent that did not belong to Grapevine. The Alpha King's gaze snapped toward the territory's edge, every instinct going rigid. Enemy forces had reached the outer boundary, and they were no longer waiting in the shadows. The second full moon rose like a memory that refused to soften, round and bright enough to turn every shadow into a confession. Grapevine territory felt it before the wolves on patrol reported it. The air carried the metallic edge of confrontation, and the forest at the borders grew restless, as if the land itself understood that an old balance was about to be tested. It was the same moonlight that had watched her exile, the same pale blaze that had turned the stone circle into a stage for betrayal. Now it returned to illuminate a different kind of judgment, one that would not be contained by elders' words or fortress walls. The enemy packs did not announce themselves with a single dramatic entrance. They moved in a coordinated spread, pressing the outer territory from multiple angles in a way that forced Grapevine's patrols to scatter. The invasion was tactical rather than savage, built on the certainty that Grapevine's leadership had fractured. They wanted confusion more than conflict. They wanted the pack to turn inward, arguing over authority while borders weakened. The first clashes were not brutal fights but tense standoffs, intercepted routes, disrupted signals, and the deliberate theft of time. Messages went missing, scouts returned late, Patrol leaders argued about whose orders mattered when elders and Alpha no longer spoke with one voice. Inside the fortress, the elders seized the crisis as opportunity. They called an emergency assembly, framing their urgency as responsibility. Their proposal was delivered with the cold confidence of wolves who believed history belonged to them. The Alpha King had become compromised, and the pack could not afford compromised leadership under threat. They suggested a regency council, until stability returned, meaning until their control was absolute. They did not say her name in the open hall, but everyone felt it hovering there. The banished wolf, the awakening power, the mercy rite, the Alpha's repeated absences, those were the stains they wanted the pack to see. The Alpha King stood before them as the fortress buzzed with fear. He saw how quickly panic made wolves reach for familiar chains. He saw how easily the elders' rhetoric slid into the minds of those who wanted someone to blame. For a moment, the crown on his head felt less like authority and more like a symbol the elders were eager to reclaim. He could have fought them with pride, could have demanded loyalty and made dissent feel like treason. But pride was the luxury of leaders who believed the world would bend. Tonight, the world would not bend. It would break whoever refused to move with it. He made his choice in silence, and that silence carried more weight than any roar. He stepped forward, reached up, and removed the emblem of his rule, an iron and silver circlet worn only during crisis councils. The hall went still. Even the elders' breath caught, because they had expected resistance, not surrender. He placed the circlet on the stone table between them with a careful steadiness, as if he were laying down something sacred rather than conceding defeat. The gesture did not feel like collapse. It felt like strategy with a wound at its center. He addressed the pack without anger, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. He declared that the territory's survival mattered more than his title, and that any leader worth following would sacrifice pride before sacrificing the pack. He named no successor. He gave the elders what they wanted on the surface while stripping him of the narrative they craved. They could not call him power-hungry now. They could not frame him as clinging to rule while the borders burned. He had taken their weapon away by turning it into his decision. Then, before the elders could reshape the moment into their triumph, he left the fortress again. He moved with the urgency of someone who knew where the true turning point waited. Titles could be reclaimed later. Lives could not. At the borderlands, the heroine felt the enemy presence like pressure against her skin, as if the territory's edges had become raw nerves. The Alpha King found her not at the ruins but along a ridge overlooking the outer trees, where moonlight spilled across open ground and made movement impossible to hide. She stood with her shoulders squared, her expression tight with a calm that came from seeing the pattern clearly. She did not ask why he had returned. She did not ask what the elders had done. Their bond carried those truths without explanation, and the urgency in his posture confirmed what the knight already told her. He told her about surrendering the crown anyway, not as confession but as fact. He did not dramatize it. He offered it like a piece of his body he had cut away to keep the rest alive. The admission landed between them with a strange heaviness. She felt a sharp twist of guilt, even though she knew the elders were the true architects of this crisis. Yet the guilt was real because she could see what he had given up, and because some part of her understood he had done it to protect her from becoming the pack's scapegoat in the middle of an invasion. The enemy packs began their push in earnest under the full moon, sweeping toward strategic points rather than charging blindly. Their leaders called out offers disguised as warnings, implying that Grapevine could be absorbed peacefully if it accepted new rule. The words were meant to tempt and fracture, to make Grapevine wolves doubt their own capacity to stand alone. The heroine listened, and her power shifted inside her like a tide turning. She could feel the territory responding to her emotion, the land itself bracing. The Alpha King moved slightly ahead of her, not to block her, but to signal to his wolves that he still stood as protector even without title. The gesture was quiet and dangerous. It invited loyalty that the elders could later punish. But he could not ask the pack to trust him if he did not place himself where trust required risk. The heroine understood then that war, in this moment, did not have to be claws and blood. It could be will against will, territory against intrusion, fear against certainty. She stepped forward, letting the full shape of what she had become rise into the open air. The moonlight seemed to tighten around her, brightening as if it recognized her as the hinge on which the night would turn. She inhaled, and the territory inhaled with her. When she howled, the sound was not simply loud. It was command made audible. The ground beneath the ridge vibrated faintly. The trees of the borderline swayed as though a wind had passed through them, but the air remained still. The enemy wolves faltered, their formation stuttering as they felt the territory push back, not with physical force, but with a sudden disorientation, as if the land rejected their presence. Pathways they had planned to use seemed to blur. Familiar scents became muddled. Their confidence broke into uncertainty because the environment itself no longer behaved like neutral ground. Her howl reached farther than she intended. It rolled through ravines and valleys and carried into forgotten dens. Distant answers rose, not as friendly reinforcements arriving on command, but as awakened presences stirred by an ancient call. Dormant wolves and hidden lineages felt the signal and turned their attention toward Greypine's borders. The enemy pack sensed that shift too, realizing they were no longer facing a single weakened territory. They were facing something that could rally the land itself. The cost of that power hit her quickly. The connection that gave her influence also drained her, pulling life from her muscles and warmth from her skin as if the territory demanded payment for every thread she tightened. Her vision blurred at the edges. Her wolf, once braided so closely with her, suddenly felt distant, as though the sheer scale of what she had summoned forced it to retreat to survive. Panic flashed through her, but she held her posture, refusing to let the enemy see weakness. The Alpha King noticed the tremor in her hands, the slight sway in her stance that she tried to hide. He moved closer, not touching, but close enough to steady her presence with his own. He could not restore what the power took, but he could bear witness, could make her feel less alone in the cost. His gaze held both awe and alarm, understanding that victory might demand too much from her. The enemy packs withdrew incrementally, their advance disrupted and their certainty fractured. It was not a clean defeat, but it was a decisive shift. Greypine's borders held. The invasion stalled under the weight of an unexpected force that could not be easily measured or challenged. The territory, awakened, had refused to be claimed. But as the enemy presence receded, the heroine's body finally yielded to the price it had been paying. Her knees buckled, and this time stubbornness could not hold her upright. The world tilted sharply. The moonlight above seemed suddenly too bright, too far away. She tried to breathe, but the air felt thin. The Alpha King caught her as she fell, lowering with her to the ground as if kneeling before something sacred. He did not call for help. He did not shout orders. He simply held her weight with careful hands, his expression stripped of all the controlled distance he had worn as ruler. In the quiet after the enemy retreat, he listened to her breathing and felt terror rise when it weakened. Her eyes fluttered, struggling to stay open. The bond between them pulsed faintly, like a thread stretched to its limit. He leaned closer, forehead nearly touching hers, as if proximity alone could keep her anchored to this world. For a moment, her chest rose with a shallow breath, then stilled again. In the pale blaze of the full moon, the Alpha King remained kneeling beside her as her heartbeat began to fade. The world did not end when her heartbeat thinned. It only narrowed. The moon remained overhead, indifferent and bright, while the forest held a silence so complete it felt like an answer. The former Alpha stayed kneeling beside her, his hands steady even as panic tried to break through his restraint. He watched her chest for movement that would not come, listened for breath that seemed too faint to trust, and in that stretched moment he understood something he had avoided for years. Leadership was not the crown on his head, it was the choices he made when no one applauded. He did not carry her back to the fortress. He knew what the elders would do with her weakness. They would call it proof that she was dangerous and unstable, even as they secretly feared the power she represented. Instead, he moved her deeper into the border woods, to a sheltered hollow where the trees grew thick and the wind could not easily reach. He built warmth with careful hands, not as a ruler directing others but as a man refusing to surrender someone he had failed once already. He stayed awake through the shifting hours, listening to the forest's quiet pulse and to the fragile line between life and loss. When she finally drew a full breath, it did not look like a miracle. It looked like stubborn refusal. Her eyelids fluttered, her expression tightening as if waking itself hurt, and her fingers curled faintly against the earth. The former Alpha did not speak her name in celebration. He only exhaled, shoulders dropping with relief so heavy it resembled grief. Survival had not restored her. It had altered her, carving away something familiar and leaving a new stillness in its place. The change became clearer as dawn grayed the sky. The constant hum of power she had carried after the ruins felt different now, quieter, but not gone. It did not surge wildly or pull at the territory like an open hand. It lay beneath her skin like a sealed ember, contained not by law but by some internal shift that made old bindings irrelevant. The curse that had awakened through exile and full moon no longer felt like a chain around her blood. It felt like a door that had closed behind her. She was no longer bound by the Elder's rules because those rules had never truly held her, they had only delayed what she was meant to become. Her wolf, however, was distant. She reached inward and found only silence where instinct used to prowl. The absence was unnerving, like losing a sense she had relied on her entire life. Yet even that loss carried a strange clarity. Without her wolf's constant noise, she could think and feel with sharp precision, as if her human mind had been forced to step forward and claim control. She did not know if the severing was permanent, but she understood it as payment. The land had answered her howl, and she had paid in pieces of herself. Back at the fortress, the political aftermath began to crack the Elder's certainty. The enemy retreat should have been celebrated, yet no one could ignore how the territory had been saved. Wolves whispered that the Elder's leadership had nearly cost them everything. Wolves whispered that the former Alpha had stood at the border when the Elders hid behind procedure. The Elders tried to frame the victory as proof of their caution, but their narrative no longer held. Fear was no longer persuasive when survival had demanded courage. The pack's reform did not arrive through a sudden revolution. It began in small refusals. Patrol leaders started questioning council directives. Families who had once deferred to elder judgment began asking for explanations. Younger wolves demanded to know why exile had been used without proof, why mercy had been treated like weakness, why sacred law felt like a tool for control rather than protection. The elders responded with familiar threats, but the threats landed differently now. The invasion had taught the pack that clinging to old systems did not guarantee safety. It only guaranteed stagnation. The former Alpha returned to the fortress without fanfare, not to reclaim his crown, but to keep the territory from splintering into chaos. He did not stride into the hall demanding obedience. He moved quietly, meeting with patrol leaders, organizing border watches, ensuring supplies reached the dens closest to the ridges. His leadership showed up in action rather than announcement. Wolves watched him work without title and felt their loyalty shift from tradition to trust. The elders noticed too, and their frustration sharpened into desperation. They could no longer control the pack through ceremony when the pack had begun to measure leaders by results. In the days that followed, guilt and healing unfolded with painful slowness between him and the heroine. She did not rush toward forgiveness, because forgiveness without accountability would feel like another cage. He did not demand it. He visited when he could, sometimes bringing food, sometimes bringing updates, sometimes simply sitting at the edge of her space and letting silence exist without pressure. Each visit carried a quiet honesty. He had failed her in the stone ring, and no words could undo it. Yet he was still here, still choosing her safety over his own comfort. She watched him from a distance that was emotional more than physical. Part of her wanted to press into the bond and let it soothe the rawness of everything that had happened. Another part of her feared that closeness would become another form of surrender. She had spent too long living inside a system built to shape her into something acceptable. She could not return to any relationship that demanded she shrink again, even if the demand came softly. The forest around the borderlands began to stabilize, and the change was subtle but undeniable. The strange distortions that had followed the curse's awakening eased. The air lost its metallic tension. The animals returned cautiously, birdsong threading into mornings that had been too quiet. The land felt less like a coiled spring and more like a living body settling after fever. It did not mean the danger was gone. It meant balance was returning, reflecting the shift within her and within the pack. Eventually, the heroine stood at the edge of the hollow and looked toward the fortress from afar. She could sense the pack's movement now like distant weather. Reform was possible, but it would require her presence in ways she was not sure she wanted. If she returned, she might become a symbol the pack used to rewrite itself. If she stayed away, she might finally have the freedom she had never been allowed to imagine. The former Alpha stood beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his steady warmth. The question hung between them without words: lead or leave. He did not offer promises. He did not tell her what the pack deserved. He simply made space for her choice, the way he should have in the beginning. In that quiet, she felt the bond between them soften, not weakening, but becoming something less like fate's chain and more like possibility. Then, from beyond the borders, a new howl rose. It was distant, unfamiliar, and layered with a tone that made the hairs on her arms lift. It was not an enemy signal like before. It sounded older, searching, as if something had heard her first howl and had been traveling ever since. The forest went still again, listening, and the heroine felt the sealed ember inside her pulse once, warning her that whatever was coming next had not been part of the Elders' plans or the Pack's reform. The new howl did not fade into the night the way ordinary calls did. It lingered in the air like a question the land itself refused to ignore. It came again the next night, closer, threaded with strain, and carrying a tone that did not match the clear confidence of an invading pack or the lonely ache of a wandering wolf. It sounded like someone searching for something they did not fully understand, compelled by an instinct they could not outrun. Each time it rose, the forest tightened its attention, and the ember of power inside the heroine answered with a faint pulse, as if recognizing a signal written in the same hidden language. She waited for no council decision. She did not ask permission from the elders, who were now too busy defending their slipping influence to control the wilderness beyond their walls. Instead, she chose movement. She and the former Alpha left at dawn, traveling beyond the familiar ridges and into sections of forest the pack maps marked only with old warnings. The journey did not feel like exile anymore. It felt like purpose. The land no longer pressed against her as an adversary. It made room, not easing the path, but acknowledging her presence the way it might acknowledge a storm that belonged to its own sky. The former Alpha stayed slightly behind her, not out of deference, but out of understanding. He had learned that standing beside her did not require him to lead. It required him to witness and support. He watched her pace carefully, attentive to the quiet exhaustion that still shadowed her since the night she had paid for victory. He did not treat her as fragile, but he no longer pretended she was unchanged. When she paused, he paused. When she listened, he kept silent. Their bond did not demand words. It was built now from shared decisions and steady respect. They found the source of the howl near a ravine where the trees grew sparse and the rock formations looked like broken ribs pushing up from the earth. The air there carried a familiar metallic tension, lighter than before but unmistakable, a hint that the old curse had left fingerprints beyond the ruins. At the ravine's edge, a lone figure stood with their back half-turned, posture rigid as if every muscle was braced against the world. The wolf's scent was wrong for grapevine, foreign, yet not enemy. There was an undercurrent beneath it, sharp and ancient, like a sealed wound reopening. The figure turned slowly, eyes reflecting moonlight even though the sun still clung to the horizon. The stranger looked younger than the heroine expected, but age meant little when curses twisted time and fear. Their expression was a controlled mask, the kind worn by someone who had learned that showing emotion invited exploitation. The heroine felt the ember in her chest pulse again, not as a threat, but as recognition. This was not an invader. This was a survivor. The stranger spoke cautiously, voice carrying the roughness of long silence. They did not introduce themselves with name or pack. They demanded to know what she was, why the land responded to her, why their own howl had led them here as if dragged by invisible rope. Suspicion sharpened their words, but beneath it was desperation that made them sound almost breathless. They admitted, in halting fragments, that something had awakened inside them months ago, growing louder with each full moon, turning sleep into visions and turning solitude into panic. They had run from every territory that felt normal, because normal territories reacted to them with fear. The heroine did not answer with authority. She answered with understanding. She told the stranger that fear was the oldest weapon packs used when they could not control what they did not understand. She did not name the curse directly at first, because naming it could make it feel like condemnation. Instead, she described the sensations, the sudden sharpening of the world, the way the land seemed to listen, the way the power felt both like inheritance and like burden. As she spoke, the stranger's shoulders loosened by a fraction, as if hearing their own experience reflected back made it less monstrous. The former Alpha watched the exchange carefully, tension simmering beneath his calm. He had lived too long with pack politics to trust anything fully, and he could feel the danger in this meeting without seeing claws. A cursed survivor could become ally or catalyst. The wrong approach could drive them into panic, and panic could trigger power neither of them could contain. Yet he did not step forward to take control. He let the heroine lead, recognizing that what mattered here was not dominance but stability. The stranger's gaze flicked toward him, and their suspicion returned briefly. They recognized the shape of an alpha even without a crown. They recognized leadership in his posture, and the memory of being hunted seemed to flare behind their eyes. The heroine noticed, and instead of dismissing their fear, she acknowledged it. She told them he was not here to judge or command. He was here because he had chosen to stand beside her even when that choice stripped him of everything the pack once called power. The words landed. The former Alpha did not react defensively. He accepted the truth of them with quiet humility, and that acceptance shifted the atmosphere. The stranger's breathing steadied. The land's tension eased slightly, as if the territory itself approved of a posture built on restraint rather than control. The heroine offered guidance rather than orders. She told the survivor that the curse did not have to turn them into a weapon. It could become a compass if they learned to listen instead of resist blindly. She described the ruins, the visions, the cost she had paid. She was honest about the fear and the temptation, about how easy it would be to let power define her as either savior or threat. Then she offered the one thing packs rarely offered those they feared, a place to learn without being punished for existing. The survivor hesitated, caught between suspicion and longing. The heroine did not press. She simply waited, letting silence do what force could not. In that quiet, the stranger's posture softened again, and they gave a small, reluctant nod. It was not full trust. It was willingness. For someone shaped by fear, willingness was the first step toward freedom. When they returned toward Grapehine's edges with the survivor in cautious company, the pack sensed it quickly. Wolves appeared at a distance, watching, whispering. The elders did not rush out. They did not dare. Their influence was weaker now, and they could not afford a confrontation that might expose them further. Instead, patrol leaders and ordinary packmates gathered in small numbers, drawn by curiosity and by the quiet pull of change. The heroine stepped into their sight line without theatricality. She did not demand acknowledgement. She did not present herself as ruler. She simply stood as proof that the pack could survive transformation without collapsing. Wolves who had once looked away in the stone ring now met her gaze longer. Some lowered their heads, not in submission, but in recognition of harm done. Others watched with wary respect, unsure what they were allowed to believe anymore. A senior patrol leader, one who had quietly questioned the elders since the invasion, stepped forward and spoke in a voice meant to carry. They did not call her Alpha. They did not offer her a crown. They called her guardian of the territory, naming her role as something beyond hierarchy. The title did not place her above them. It placed her beside the land itself, as someone who protected balance rather than commanded bodies. The shift rippled through the gathered wolves. It felt like the pack exhaling after years of holding breath. The elders' system depended on the idea that power must sit in a single throne, controlled by rules only they interpreted. A guardian could not be controlled in the same way. A guardian answered to the territory, to survival, to truth. The former Alpha stood a step behind her, not diminished, but reshaped. He accepted the new identity forming around him without bitterness. He was no longer the crown, he was the steady hand beside the guardian, the one who could translate change into structure, who could keep wolves fed and borders watched while she carried the heavier, stranger burden of the land's attention. Their bond stabilized into something clean and strong, no longer a contest of dominance or a trap of fate. It became mutual strength, two forces aligned by choice. Beyond Grapehine, the world began to respond. Scouts brought word of neighboring territories shifting their patrol lines, of distant packs sending cautious emissaries instead of raiding parties. Rumors moved faster than wolves, carried by wind and instinct. The guardian had risen, and Alpha had laid down his crown. Ancient power had awakened without turning into destruction. Some territories grew fearful, others grew curious. Either way, the balance beyond the forest was changing, and Grapehine was no longer a quiet, predictable land. That night, as the heroine stood at the border ridge and listened to the forest breathe, she lifted her eyes to the moon out of habit. The sight made her go still. The moon's light looked subtly wrong, its glow tinged with a hue she could not name, as if it was sliding into a phase she had never seen before. The ember inside her pulsed once, urgent and wary, warning that the sky itself was shifting into unfamiliar territory. The transformed moon rose without apology, wearing an unfamiliar hue that made the world look newly forged. It was not the blood-bright glare that had witnessed her exile, nor the clean silver that had once marked ordinary nights. This light carried a muted radiance, as if the sky itself had shifted into a phase meant for endings and beginnings at the same time. The forest responded with a quiet steadiness, no longer tense with awakening, no longer holding its breath for catastrophe. It felt balanced, alert, and strangely calm, as though the land had finally recognized its own rhythm again. Grapehine territory had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. The fortress still stood, but it no longer felt like the center of everything. Decisions moved outward into patrol circles and communal councils, shaped by those who did the work rather than those who guarded old titles. The elders still existed, but their influence had narrowed into advisory shadows. They could no longer exile a wolf with vague accusations and call it sacred law. The pack had learned, painfully and publicly, that fear-based rule did not protect them. It only made them vulnerable, both to enemies outside and to rot within. The heroine did not sit on a throne because there was no throne left to claim. Wolves did not bow when she passed. They looked at her differently now, with a respect that did not ask her to become smaller. They gave her space, not out of fear, but out of recognition that what she carried was not a rank. It was responsibility. The territory responded to her presence in subtle ways, paths seeming clearer when she walked, the air shifting when she listened, the night quieting when she needed focus. She did not treat it as entitlement. She treated it as an ongoing conversation with something older than pack politics. The former alpha stood beside her in that new order as naturally as if he had been born for it. Without the crown, his movements looked lighter, less burdened by ceremony. He still led, but not with commands that demanded obedience. He led with consistency, showing up where work needed to be done, speaking to wolves who felt uncertain, organizing patrol rotations, and carrying responsibility without using it as a weapon. Wolves followed him because he was reliable, not because law required it. That shift mattered more than any title could have. Between him and the heroine, love grew without being declared. It did not announce itself with dramatic confession or public claim. It showed up in small, persistent choices that accumulated into something unbreakable. He brought her water before she remembered thirst. She watched the border ridges with him when the night felt too quiet. He noticed when her strength dimmed and adjusted the day's demands without making it seem like pity. She noticed when the old guilt tightened his jaw and eased the moment by simply staying near. Their closeness did not erase the past. It held the past carefully, refusing to let it poison what they were building. Some evenings, they sat in the quiet near the ruins, still standing, still humming faintly in the background of the world, without touching. The space between them was not distance. It was respect. They had learned that the bond was powerful enough without forcing it into a shape the old pack would recognize. They did not need dominance. They did not need ceremony. The forest around them had become their witness, and the moon overhead had become their clock, marking the steady passage of healing rather than counting down to disaster. The cursed survivor she had guided found footing in the new structure as well, not as a threat contained by rules, but as a life supported by understanding. The pack's willingness to adapt spread outward like a slow, deliberate tide. Neighboring territories that had once tested Greypine's borders now sent emissaries with cautious respect, drawn by the rumor that a pack had remade itself without collapsing. Some came seeking alliance. Some came seeking answers they were afraid to ask within their own lands. The heroine watched those visitors carefully, aware that change attracted both hope and opportunists. Yet Greypine held steady, rooted in a shared decision to stop feeding fear. On the night of the transformed moon's highest rise, the pack gathered again at the stone ring where her exile had been announced. The circle looked the same on the surface, old stones, familiar ground, but the atmosphere was entirely different. No accusation sharpened the air. No elders stood with smug certainty. Wolves came by choice, not obligation. They came to witness a turning point that belonged to all of them, not to a council's control. The heroine stood at the center, not because she demanded the space, but because the pack offered it. She felt the weight of memory press against her ribs, the humiliation, the betrayal, the way her own howl had once sounded like exile made audible. For a moment, the old grief rose, sharp enough to sting. Then she looked around and saw faces that no longer turned away. She saw wolves who had once been silent now standing with open acknowledgement of what had been done. She saw the former alpha at the ring's edge, not elevated, not crowned, watching her with unwavering steadiness. The grief did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. She inhaled and felt the territory inhale with her. When she howled this time, it did not tear out of her like a wound. It rose with clarity, deep and resonant, carrying strength that did not need to prove itself. The sound traveled across the ring, through the pines, over the ridges, and into the dark beyond the borders. It carried no plea. It carried belonging rewritten on her terms. The pack answered. One howl rose, then another, then many, braided together until the air vibrated with a chorus that turned the night into something sacred without cruelty. The sound did not feel like submission to her. It felt like unity built from choice. Wolves who had once used tradition as a weapon now used it as a bridge, reshaping old ritual into something that healed rather than harmed. The former alpha stepped closer, moving into the ring without hesitation. He did not stand behind her like a guard, and he did not stand before her like a ruler. He stood beside her, shoulder aligned with hers, equal in the only way that mattered. His presence steadied the bond between them, turning it from an ancient tether into a shared commitment. The pack saw it and did not recoil. They understood now that leadership did not require chains, and love did not require ownership. As the chorus faded into softer echoes, the heroine turned her head slightly toward him. Their eyes met, and the exchange held more truth than any spoken vow. He had followed her howl into darkness once, not knowing why. Now he followed her openly, knowing exactly what he was choosing. She did not need him to kneel. She did not need him to promise. She needed him to keep choosing, and he did. They lifted their voices together one final time, the united howl rolling outward with a force that felt like destiny being rewritten in real time. The forest listened. The territory held. The transformed moon shone down as if sealing the moment into the world's memory. Far beyond Grapepine's ridges, the howl carried into places no one in the pack had mapped, reaching ears that had never heard the names and stirring answers no one could yet predict. She was never meant to return as the wolf they exiled. She came back as the force that changed everything. The Alpha King did not reclaim his crown, he chose something greater. Together, they ended a system built on fear and silence. Her howl no longer marked exile, but belonging. And in that sound, a new destiny was born. If this story stayed with you, someone else out there needs to hear it too. Pass it along to the one person who loves dark fate, forbidden bonds, and powerful transformations. More stories like this are already on the way, shaped by choices just like yours. Now here's the real question. What country are you watching from, and did this story find you at the right moment?